In the sodden underbelly of 1970s Manchester, where air from the factories hung heavy with the ghosts of better tomorrows, a single night cracked open the world of music. June 4, 1976, the Sex Pistols, raw and unrepentant, stormed the lesser-free Trade Hall. In the small, sweat-soaked crowd, two boys from Salford, Bernard Sumner and Peter Hook, stood transfixed, and they were not alone. Hi, I'm Andy, host of Poetic Wax, a weekly music history series where I dig into the record collection I've been building since the 1990s to explore the history of a band, album, or song from within. The Sex Pistols gig in Manchester was actually the first of two Pistols shows that summer, the second being July 20, and it's one of the most mythologized concerts in all of rock history. Only about 40 to 50 people were in the room. Precisely 46 if you ask Peter Hook.
Everybody was at that gig. I mean, well, there wasn't everybody because I think Pete Shelley told me they sold 46 tickets.
Yes.
And my ticket number 23.
Yet it directly inspired an astonishing number of musicians to form bands. And more. Organized by Howard Devoto and Pete Shelley, the two had already talked about forming a band, but seeing the Sex Pistols live made it real. They debuted as the Buzzcocks less than 2 months later, July of 1976, and they released the Spiral Scratch EP in January of 1977. Mark E. Smith was in the audience with his school friend Tony Friel. The gig was the direct catalyst for Smith forming The Fall a few weeks later. Friel would join as the group's original bassist. Morrissey has spoken about being there many times. Morrissey and Marr later cited the Manchester punk explosion that began that night as the soil from which the Smiths grew. It extended beyond future musicians into other influential industry players. Tony Wilson, who would become the nucleus of Factory Records and Hacienda. Rob Gretton, who would go on to manage Joy Division and New Order. Martin Hannett, who would go on to produce Joy Division and the Buzzcocks, and many more. Mick Hucknall, later of Simply Red, claims he was there and that the experience changed his life. But we're here to talk about the two boys from Salford, Bernard Sumner and Peter Hook. Hook and Sumner formed their childhood friendship in the Manchester Council estates. They weren't musicians and hadn't really even considered that path. But that night changed things. Hook has talked about seeing Led Zeppelin, but as great as the legends were, they didn't inspire action.
I remember the weirdest thing was that I saw Led Zeppelin in the same week that I saw the Sex Pistols. And I went to see the Sex Pistols because I'd been reading about them in the evening news and on the music press. I saw the advert for their gig and it was 50p.
However, that June 4, 1976 show, as with many others in attendance, gave them permission. It wasn't that the Sex Pistols were any good. In fact, it was the exact opposite.
And the interesting thing about the Sex Pistols, unlike Led Zeppelin, was that they seemed to have a fight at every gig. That felt more understandable in a way. But I never looked at Led Zeppelin and thought, I could do that. When I saw the Sex Pistols, because they were so relatable and so bad, I thought I could do that.
In a Mojo article by John Savage in July of 1994, Sumner has said that he felt the Sex Pistols had destroyed the myth of being a pop star, of a musician being some kind of god that you had to worship. Now, that was the difference between seeing a band like Led Zeppelin and watching Sex Pistols tear it up on stage. The show demonstrated to many in the audience that it didn't matter how good you were. Punk was entirely accessible, and anyone could do it. Proof? Sex Pistols had a major label deal. As the pair left the lesser-free Trade Hall, Peter turned to Bernard and said they should start a band. It was literally as simple as that. Sumner already had a guitar and had started playing around with it.
Now, Barney could play a few chords because he got a guitar for Christmas off his mum and dad. And he said to me, you'll have to get a bass. And I went, right, get a bass.
So Hook borrowed 35 quid from his parents and took the bus down to Maisels in Manchester to pick up a bass.
So I went to a shop in Piccadilly in Manchester called Maisels that had cheap guitars. And I said to the guy, I want a bass. want a bass, bass. And he said, well, which bass? I said, bass, bass. So he just picked one up and said, what about this one then? And I went, no, that's got 4 strings. My mate's has got 6. And he said, that's because your mate's got a guitar, you dick. He said, a bass has 4 strings. So I thought, oh, well, that's got to be easier.
Joining the duo on drums was Terry Mason, who had also attended the Sex Pistols gig, and they went about finding a vocalist. They posted an ad at a local Virgin record shop, and Ian Curtis, who knew them from past shows, responded. He was hired without an audition. According to Sumner in Touching from a Distance by Deborah Woodruff, Ian was all right to get on with, and that's what we based the whole group on. If we liked someone, they were in. But Mason wouldn't stick around, in that role at least. Instead, he stepped in as the band's manager and roadie. He was replaced by Tony Tabak in May of 1977. 2 days later, on May 29, 1977, at the Electric Circus, the band would play their first gig, supporting Buzzcocks.
We weren't called Warsaw. We couldn't make up our mind for the name, and the Buzzcocks named us. They called us Stiff Kittens.
Now, Tabak wouldn't stick around either, being replaced a month later by Steve Brotherdale in June of 1977, joining Warsaw at Panine Sound Studios in Oldham to record a 5-song demo that July. Now, more on that in a bit. But his aggressive personality quickly got him fired after a brawl at a Buzzcocks afterparty. With Brotherdale gone, they resorted back to the tactic that gave them Ian Curtis, posting an advert for a drummer in a music shop window. This yielded a lone response, Stephen Morris, who actually knew Ian Curtis from school, and he joined in August of 1977.
I attended the King's School in Macclesfield, which Ian attended. He was a prefect, and I was a bad boy. Yes, when they discovered that the contents of my desk were not the reference books that should have been there, but empty bottles of cough medicine and dry cleaning fluid, I was shown the door post-haste, and Ian, who I must have seen, but probably in an addled haze failed to recognise, had the job of going round inspecting the other pupils' pupils for signs of dilation.
Now, the foursome was complete, but one more member would arrive less than a year later. Enter Rob Gretton, another Pistols gig attendee who caught an early Warsaw show in April 1978, and within a month would become their fierce manager, replacing Mason. Now, true to the Sex Pistols show, in the early days, Joy Division was heavily influenced by punk rock. It's a sound that permeates Warsaw, a bootleg collection of pre-Joy Division era recordings. The bootleg oscillates back and forth between the raw, gritty punk leanings of the band's early days and the darker, more introspective sounds that we all know and love from Joy Division. My copy here includes the 5 tracks recorded before Morris joined, concluding the record. It also includes 11 tracks recorded at Arrow Studios in Manchester during May 1978, also dubbed the RCA Album Sessions. A final track sandwiched in between them was an at the time uncredited 3rd track, now known as You Said, from the Comachino Flexi recorded at Britannia Row in March of 1980. So that one was actually after, obviously, they became Joy Division. By early 1978, the band had a problem. Another London punk group called Warsaw Pact had released an album. Confusion was essentially guaranteed. They needed a new name, something colder, something that carried the weight of the world that they were trying to describe. Peter Hook remembers flipping through a paperback in Bernard's room, The House of Dolls by Kotzenik 135633 from 1953. House of Dolls was a harrowing survivor account of Auschwitz. On one page was the phrase Joy Division, the name the Nazis gave the barracks where female prisoners were forced into prostitution for the guards and favored inmates. We thought it was a strong image. It wasn't meant to be pro-Nazi or anything like that. It was anti, really. It was about the dehumanization, the hopelessness. That's what we felt walking around Manchester in 1977. Sumner echoed this in a 1994 interview with Mojo, calling it a mirror to Manchester's hopelessness. It's important to note that these Joy Divisions did exist, But accounts question whether Nazi soldiers actually partook. Rather, they often had their own brothels outside of the camps. Now, the band knew the new name would provoke, and it most certainly did. Controversy erupted right after their 1978 EP, An Ideal for Living, whose sleeve featured a Hitler Youth drummer illustration drawn by Sumner but credited as the pseudonym Bernard Albright. This, combined with the name, led to widespread accusations of neo-Nazi leanings in the press. NME and Sounds received irate letters and feedback branding them as fascists. Now, this just encouraged the band to double down rather than backpedal, viewing the uproar as free publicity and a punk ethos of confrontation. They never issued a formal apology. Instead, interviews showed their defiance. In a 1978 Sounds piece, Curtis dismisses the fuss. Names are just words. It's the music that matters, while admitting the shock value appealed to their harsh and beautiful aesthetic. Their first performance as Joy Division was January 25, 1978, at Pip's Disco in Manchester, though still advertised as Warsaw, so anyone would actually turn up. They had developed a bit of a national buzz at that point, so they needed the name recognition to draw the audience. But the sound that night was already different, slower, heavier, colder. Punk snarl had become something that instead echoed off the walls. Before we circle back to a few other attendees from the Sex Pistols gig, I want to give a quick shout out to some of my channel members. You can sign up today and get early access to new videos, an occasional one-off members-only video, and support the channel for just $2 a month. Or, if you enjoyed this video, you can give a one-off super thanks tip. I super appreciate it. On May 25, 1979, Tony Wilson, the charismatic Factory Records co-founder, finally caught Joy Division live at Manchester's gritty Russell Club, a venue he'd already co-opted for his experimental Factory Nights. That evening's set, marked by Ian Curtis's spasmic stage convulsions and the band's brooding post-punk pulse, sealed the deal. Overwhelmed, Wilson reportedly declared it the best gig he'd ever seen and rushed to sign them to Factory on the spot, inking a famously egalitarian contract, allegedly with his own blood, that prioritized artistic freedom over profit. It emphasized Factory's artist-first ethos of, quote, company owns nothing, artists have the freedom to fuck off. Wilson would later clarify it wasn't actually written in blood, but the story endures. It actually found its way into the film adaptation of 24-Hour Party People. This pivotal moment birthed Unknown Pleasures and cemented Manchester's underground renaissance. Aided by Martin Hannett, who had attended the first Sex Pistols show, he joined the four lads in a rehearsal room where they would record their debut, warping the music into what sounded like the apocalypse, recorded inside a glacier.
When we recorded Unknown Pleasures, we didn't just go in and record Unknown Pleasures and go home. We did a lot of songs. We had no idea that was what it was going to be. I mean, which is what every band does when you make your first record. You just go in and you do your best, and then you pick the best out of what you've done.
You needed mine, hadn't you, to realise what you had. We'd had a little dabble with Martin, and we were impressed by him, by his knowledge, by his charisma. On Unknown Pleasures, it was pretty much the same.
In just over 2 years, they would go on to release two perfect albums, Unknown Pleasures in 1979 and Closer in 1980. A handful of singles they produced during that time still feel like dispatches from the end of the world. And then on May 18, 1980, Ian Curtis took his own life on the eve of their first American tour.
Even when he was ill, he never stopped loving the group and telling you exactly what you needed to hear.
And that was what was the weird thing. When he started to suffer from depression and started to go down, it's like we couldn't do it for him. And that was the big problem, of course, when he passed, was because we felt like a rudderless ship. Yeah, we always relied on him.
Now, everything should have ended there. But instead, the three survivors, Barney, Hookie, Steve, made a pact at Ian's funeral. The band dies with Ian, but the music keeps moving. They renamed themselves New Order, retained Gretton as their manager, added Gillian Gilbert as a fourth member, and put an added emphasis on sequencers, and just as they had done with Joy Division and post-punk, accidentally invented pretty much all of modern dance music. But Joy Division never really left. Every time you hear a bass line that walks around in the dark, every time a voice cracks open and shows you its wounds, every time a synth pulse feels like a heartbeat, albeit a dark one in an empty cathedral, that's them. This was just one of many of the stories that stemmed from that mythical night with the Sex Pistols. When 40-odd people in a tiny room in 1976 set off a chain reaction that still ripples through every lonely bedroom, through every packed nightclub, and through every pair of headphones at 3 a.m. when the world feels too heavy and sleep just won't come. And it all began when 4 boys from a broken city looked into the void and taught the void how to dance like no one was watching. That's the birth and the eternal life of Joy Division.